Hello students, today we're discussing the second principle of liberty, which as you know says a free people cannot survive under a republican constitution unless they remain virtuous and morally strong. And it's kind of interesting that one of the discussions that they were having before they declared independence in the colonies was this: are we good enough for freedom? Whoever's heard that kind of a question before? Are we good enough for freedom? What does that imply? That presupposes that a people must be what? Must be good in order to be free. You ever hear that discussion nowadays? That you have to be good to be free? It also implies that maybe we could say it this way, that you have to attain a certain level of goodness, and if you drop down below that level, your freedom begins to erode very quickly. We're going to talk about that today. I want to, first of all, to refer you to the bottom of page 49. Here's a quote by Ben Franklin, where he says, "Only a virtuous people are capable of freedom. Some of the fundamental... As nations become corrupt and vicious, they have more need of masters." Have you noticed that? Who asks for masters? Does a free, independent people ask for masters? No. Who asks for masters? Those people who are not virtuous, who usually want to turn things over to some other people and say, "You do it, don't worry me, don't bother with me, you run it." Anyway, only a virtuous people are capable of freedom. Ben Franklin. And so goodness in the founders' day was synonymous with virtue. And I want you to turn to page 50. And here's the way one historian, Gordon Wood, described what the founders meant when they say you have to be virtuous. And there has to be a certain amount of public virtue in order to have freedom. Listen to what he says here. He says on page 50, middle of the page, "In a republic, however, each man must somehow be persuaded to submerge his personal wants into the greater good of the whole. This willingness of the individual to sacrifice his private interest for the good of the community, such patriotism or love of country, the 18th century termed public virtue." You understand that? In other words, here's a people who may want personally certain things. For example, you may have a store owner who would purchase goods from Europe in order to sell in the colonies. May purchase goods from England. And because of the heavy oppressive taxation or other regulations from England, he would decide, I am not going to buy goods from England anymore. And it's a free will decision. See, that's what the founders called public virtue. Because for the good of the whole, for the good of the community, may drive him out of business, that kind of a decision. I'm going to give up my individual wants, my personal wants, for the good of the whole, because in the end, we will all be better off. I want to refer you now to page 54. As James Madison talks about the necessity for virtue. Are you with me? Page 54, the quote there. He says, "Is there no virtue among us? If there be not, we are in a wretched situation. No theoretical checks," that's checks and balances, "no form of government, republic, democracy, whatever, can render us secure. To suppose that any form of government will secure liberty or happiness without any virtue in the people is a chimerical idea." Chimerical, what does that mean? Imaginary. It's a fantasy to think that we can have a great form of government without virtue. He says it won't work. That's a fantasy. If there be sufficient virtue and intelligence in the community, it will be exercised in the selection of these men, the leaders, so that we do not depend upon their virtue or put confidence in our rulers, but in the people who are to choose them. Isn't that beautiful? And then, of course, Jefferson follows up with that, and he says, virtue is not hereditary. In other words, you don't buy your way into being virtue. You're not born into it. It's not hereditary. It must be earned and developed and taught to every generation. And the founders were the first to say, if you don't teach it to every generation, you can lose it in one generation.